Now that I have magically appeared, what do you make someone who lives by the beach and enjoys some cold bevies on a hot summer's day? Well, if you're a woodworker, you make them a beach serving tray. So follow along to see how I make a bunch of mistakes while thinking this will all be super simple. We're starting by ripping down some white oak and then cross-cutting to size. Apologies for the camera angle on the rip cuts. I honestly thought I had angled it up a little bit more. I did have a cross-cut sled. Well, I've still got it, but I wasn't paying attention one day, and when making a bevel cut, I managed to slice out a good chunk of the bottom, which meant the sled began flexing. And that means it's basically useless now. In the time-honoured tradition of woodworking, I am now too busy to make a new sled, although I really should find the time to remake it. This piece of straight pine attached to my miter gauge seems to be doing the trick at the moment. Also, let me know in the comments if you're a fan of the Gaslight Anthem. I was making this just after their 2024 Sydney show, and it's been a long time since Australian tours, but it was well worth the wait. Anyway, we're here for woodworking, not for my aging music taste. Ultimately, what we're aiming for here are 2 long pieces and 2 short pieces, with a mitered cut on both ends. Now, I haven't told you who I'm making this for, but if you watched last week's video, then you can probably guess that it's for my parents. If you didn't watch the world's easiest project, then the link is in the description. Seriously, my 5-year-old made a good chunk of it. After decades of living in suburbia, they have retired to the coast where they are a short walk from the beach. So what better way to pair their wine bottle holder than with a serving tray they can put their snacks on? I'm using a scrap piece of wood clamped here to my makeshift miter gauge fence to ensure that my sizing remains the same for all of these pieces. Once I'd cut all those to size, it was time for life to interfere. So here I am the next day slicing out the grooves I'm going to sit the plywood base in. For my Freedom Unit friends, I believe this is 1/8 of an inch. For the rest of us normal people, this would be about 3mm. It's the thickness of the blade or the kerf if you don't want to think about measuring. I learnt a very important lesson here. It's incredibly important to keep pressure against the fence when making these grooves. Otherwise, your groove can end up as crooked as a dog's hind leg. That isn't foreshadowing, is it? I've also since upgraded my push blocks to one with a lip on the back, making these grooves a lot easier and safer in the future. Push blocks are super easy to make, or you can buy them for cheap on Amazon. Honestly, don't just use the push stick that comes with your table saw. It doesn't allow you to put enough pressure down on your piece. Once my grooves were cut, it was time to cut the base to rough size. You want to be oversized here and sneak up on it. That's really the secret to making most panels. Cut it too small and you'll be up fecal matter creek without a paddling implement. Well, not really, because you could just cut your border pieces down to size, but then your final size ends up smaller than what you planned. Still, my wife keeps telling me it's not about the size, it's about how you use it. What? Keep your mind out of the gutter. I'm referring to the efficient use of space on a small serving tray. When cutting this, it is important you go slow and don't try to push it through, because this is so thin it got a little caught up on the lip of the throat plate and I had to ever so gently bend it up and over. It was a little sketchy and the first time I've had a piece get stuck. But I got through it in the end without doing anything stupid or causing a kickback. But once it's to size and you have snuck up on it, it's time for a dry fit. Look at that. Marvellous stuff. Richie Benno fans, you'll know what I'm talking about. Now it is time to pre-sand the interiors of the pieces to save yourself a headache in the future. This is one of the first things I learned when I made my first boxes. Sanding the interior of your box also breaks up your sanding time. You don't have to spend one giant bunch of time sanding everything. I am pleased to say that I have also got hold of a dust hose connector to fit the back of this sander, so there is no longer a mask needed when sanding. And at the risk of sounding like Grandpa Simpson, there's an interesting story behind this sander, because it was actually my grandfather's. Was he a woodworker? No. Why did he have it? I honestly couldn't tell you. but if you knew him, you knew that would make perfect sense. Pa passed away about 6 years ago now. When we cleaned out his shed, we found a whole pile of tools that we suspected he'd forgotten he ever bought. Because next to this sander was a detail sander, fresh in its box. The jigsaw I now use had never been opened and had sat patiently on a shelf. I have a socket set from him that was well used, but also one of 3 socket sets. Okay, that last one I found to actually be necessary, as I also have 3 socket sets, all for different reasons. After sanding, it's time to glue everything up with blue painter's tape and Titebond Original. This is where things almost fell apart, quite literally. First, I thought I had turned the end up the wrong way. Yep, well done. Then, on trying to slide the base in, I realised it would be much easier to attach it to the long side first, and then fold the ends up. Well done, we're slowly getting there. And by the way, I'm only gluing the corners so the wood movement of the oak doesn't blow apart the base. Then I needed a little bit of muscle to make that 3mm ply conform to the slightly wobbly grooves I'd made, and now whatever issues I've made for myself will have to be fixed with sanding. Seriously, a lot of sanding that luckily you won't have to sit through because of the magic of editing. Now we are looking at the legs. I screwed this up, but I don't know it yet. For now, I am blissfully sanding them to a nice rounded shape. This $50 disc sander, by the way, is awesome for this job and has been worth it for my small shop. I haven't looked at really getting a large one because I don't quite have the space or even the storage space at the moment, but having something this small that can easily pack away into a corner means that I've got something a little more high powered when I need to finesse shapes. Now, this is something I am incredibly proud of. I built this mitered cut sled and then used it to successfully slice out my mitered corners. It was a pretty simple build. 1 sheet of 12mm or 1/2 inch plywood as the body of the sled, 2 pieces of mitered pine CA glued then screwed in, and this is where your frame or box sits. Then on the back you make a little timber kind of hook out of 3 pieces of pine or extra plywood, kind of whatever you've got sitting around that square, so that it rides along the fence and you attach it with CA glue and screws. I'm not a big fan of jigs for the sake of them, because honestly you could really have an entire shop full of jigs if you really wanted to. I'm very much someone who makes a jig when I need it, and this one came in handy right then and there. Now, for these miters, I had to cut them about 6mm or 1/4 inch thick as I cut my splines on the thicker side. My trusty inbuilt glue spreader did the job here, and would you look at that, like a glove. I'm using Jarrah splines here as I think the contrasting colours work nicely together, and I always like to try and include some kind of local timber if I am using an international species as kind of the main body of a piece. Once the glue is set, I get to flush trimming them by hand. This did prove a little tricky at first, but like all things woodworking, the more you do it, the better you get. Although for the next time, I'll be working out a way to clamp this thing down, making it a lot easier and a lot faster. Anyway, by the time I'd sliced up all 4 splines, I was a seasoned pro. Let me know in the comments if you're a fan of the Japanese pull saw or if you use something else for this job. With the tray itself essentially done, it's back to the legs, and I used a doweling jig here to act as a drill guide to ensure my holes were straight. I started the hole using the doweling jig, then removed the doweling jig to ensure that I could drill all the way through. I also used a Forstner bit to carve out a hole for the dowel stretcher that will go in between the legs to help keep them straight. Speaking of that dowel, there it is. I actually have no idea what species it is or even where I got it. It was just sitting in my spare wood pile. Now it is over to sanding, and more sanding. If you don't like sanding, then I'm afraid woodworking isn't for you. And here is where I'm fixing my mistake on the legs. I drilled the holes too close to the end of the tray, meaning the legs wouldn't actually fully straighten and do their job. So I had to use the sander to take a few mil off and allow the legs to open and close. I also ended up using my pull saw to slice off a small piece at the same end to take some of the work off the sander. After that, I could begin finishing. Because this is going to be used for food, I initially went with the beeswax finish. However, I wasn't actually satisfied with that in the end because it looked a bit janky on the plywood. My wife pointed out that firstly, the beeswax looked nasty on the plywood, and secondly that my parents will probably end up using some kind of plate to hold their food on the tray. So it's best I stained the plywood a little bit darker. I chose to leave the beeswax on the oak frame and legs rather than refinish it, firstly because I didn't feel like refinishing a couple of days before Christmas, and secondly because I didn't want something on it that would be off-gassing in the house just before Christmas. With finishing done, it was over to the hardware. I'm sure you noticed those lines of black CA glue. There were some bug holes on the underside of the tray. I scraped the CA glue off the surface and then refinished the bottom. I just didn't record that bit. I used some simple bolts and nuts to act as a hinge. Dad ended up replacing the nuts with a wing nut to make it easier to turn, which is probably the better idea. Then I glued in the dowel. I wasn't satisfied with the hold the glue had, so I popped an 18 gauge brad nail into each side, while I wasn't recording when I did that. I was also very excited to get the handles attached. Often when I DIY stuff at home, I end up with an extra hole because I haven't been exact. Woodworking though has taught me many different ways to be accurate when marking and drilling holes, so I can happily report that no extra holes were drilled in this project. And with that, the serving tray was done. The mitered corners looked great, the hardware matched the timber, and the tray, importantly, actually worked. If you enjoyed that video or learned something, please consider liking or subscribing, and I'll see you next time.